Politics has always been a part of debates over the Supreme Court and Supreme Court nominations. It didn't start with Clarence Thomas or Robert Bork or Brett Kavanaugh or wherever you want to point to. George Washington had a nominee rejected for political reasons. So it's not like we can go back to some halcyon time where politics doesn't matter with this stuff.
You're watching Restoring America, where we shine a light on the fundamental values of this country and all the reasons why they're worth saving. This week, we're going to talk about the one branch of government the left can't stand, the Supreme Court. I'm Kayla McGee-White, and this is Restoring America. Democrats have made it quite clear in recent years that they'd rather tear down the Supreme Court entirely than abide by the decisions made by the bench's conservative majority. They've hid their radical opposition to the Supreme Court behind the guise of reform, whether that be some sort of court-packing scheme or a binding ethics code. President Joe Biden's recent court reform proposals include a little bit of both. The proposal, released earlier this summer, would place term limits on justices, it would require them to sign a new ethics code, and it would even reverse a recent Supreme Court ruling that found presidents have immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts. This was simply a decision the left didn't like. Some of these reforms might sound reasonable rather than radical, but as my guest today will explain, they're bad policies, made even worse by the fact that they're completely unnecessary. They're also bad politics. Remember, the motivation by Biden and other Democrats isn't to strengthen the Supreme Court through these reforms. It's to bring the Supreme Court to heel. They want the court to stop issuing decisions that challenge the left's agenda. So don't think of Biden's proposal as a package of reforms. Think of it as an intimidation tactic. But before we get to my guest today, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. And for more, head to washingtonexaminer.com. With me today is Ilya Shapiro, the Director of Constitutional Studies at the Manhattan Institute and the author of the forthcoming book, Lawless, The Miseducation of America's Elites. Ilya, thanks so much for joining us. You wrote an article for the Washington Examiner magazine recently about President Joe Biden's Supreme Court reform proposals, and you point out that this is not the first time Democrats have thrown a fit about the court when they disagree with some of the decisions. You specifically mentioned FDR's court-packing scheme, and what were the consequences of that, and what can Democrats learn from that this time around?
Well, even beyond FDR's court-packing scheme, which I'll get to in a moment, politics has always been a part of debates over the Supreme Court and Supreme Court nominations. It didn't start with Clarence Thomas or Robert Bork or Brett Kavanaugh or wherever you want to point to. George Washington had a nominee rejected for political reasons. So it's not like we can go back to some halcyon time where politics doesn't matter with this stuff. But that's what gets us to FDR and then to now. FDR was frustrated that the old men of the court at the time were thwarting his New Deal programs. So he proposed to add a number, he was disingenuous, he said, to help them do their work, because they couldn't do their work, which would give him a majority. That was roundly rejected in Congress. His own vice president campaigned against it. A couple of justices came out publicly against it, and in that year's midterm election in 38, the Democrats lost more than 80 seats in the House and 8 in the Senate. Fast forward to the modern day, and in the last Democratic primary in 2020, of course, we didn't really have a primary this year, but in 2020, Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders were the only two Democrats running who did not go in for court packing. And Sanders, I'm not going to do the accent, but he said, look, if we do this, then the Republicans will do it, and we'll go tit for tat. In 50 years, we're going to have 87 justices. It's no good. Well, now, finally, I don't know about whether Senator Sanders has changed his view, but Joe Biden has gone in for this court packing. And I think it's going to redound to the same way that FDR did. It's unpopular with the public, trying to tweak the Supreme Court for political reasons. But look, the way that you control the court is the old-fashioned way, as FDR discovered. He was thwarted in 38. Just 3 years later, he had made 7 nominations and took control of the court. So maintaining political power and making those nominations is the way to go. Otherwise, voters see through it.
So let's talk about some of the specific reforms that Biden has proposed. He's proposed term limits. He's proposed an ethics code that justices would be required to sign. You argue that these reforms aren't even necessary in the first place. Can you explain why that is?
All of this talk about reform is purely the product of frustration with those on the left, Democrats and other progressive activists, that they've lost control of the court for the first time since FDR, since before FDR. So they're trying to roll out these changes for their own political benefits, to take, it's not some good government reform that there's a platonic ideal of number of years to serve or number of justices or anything like this. They want the court to rule differently. They're frustrated, and so they come out with these things. Now, they're a little more subtle with the messaging now. Term limits happens to be popular among the public. If you ask just in general, should justices be term limited, it's not a bad idea having them at 18 years staggered. If there's 9 of them, you have a vacancy every 2 years. Every presidential term is guaranteed 2, rather than kind of the morbid health watches over octogenarian justices and randomness in the vacancies. But if you look a little farther into this proposal, if the current justices aren't grandfathered, well, that's just a bare-knuckle ploy to get Alito, Roberts, and Thomas off the court. That's court packing again. If the current justices are grandfathered, well, then are we going to expand the court, by justice every 2 years until there's natural attrition? Then it's going to come back. There's no way to do this without politics coming into play. And then also, you would actually need a constitutional amendment. Because the Constitution says they serve during good behavior, meaning they can be impeached, but that's it. And these cutesy ways of trying to designate them as senior justices and keep their pay and what have you, that just doesn't fly. So again, this is just a pure politicized thing. If we were drawing up the court from scratch, if politics, were of no moment, then yeah, maybe it could be a good idea to increase public confidence in the court to have term limits. But the way that Biden's proposing it, it's no good.
So as you mentioned, there has always been a little bit of politicking when it comes to the Supreme Court, specifically with appointments. But especially in recent years, it seems that the Supreme Court is taking up a large chunk of the political debate. And yet the institution hasn't changed. So what has changed? Is it the American public? Is it the way that we perceive the court?
I'm glad you asked that, Kaylee, because what has changed, as you said, is not the involvement of politics. It's that nominations are focused on judicial philosophy, and ultimately we're at the culmination of several trends where divergent interpretive themes or theories map onto partisan preference at a time when the parties are more sordid and ideologically polarized than they've been since at least the Civil War. So it used to be that just like you had in the House and Senate, conservative Democrats, liberal Republicans, you don't have that in the elected branches. Similarly now in terms of judges and judicial philosophies, if you want an originalist, someone who looks at the Constitution for what the original public meaning of its text was when ratified, typically you want a Republican making that appointment. If you want a living constitutionalism where the Constitution grows and evolves along with societal mores, then that's going to come from politicians on the left, the Democrats appointing them. And because the court is called upon to resolve more and more of the political disputes in American public life, you're going to have these zero-sum games. But that's not just because the court's not, reaching out to resolve these disputes. It's in part because Congress is declining to pass laws on big controversies, and so they're thrown into the executive branch administrative agencies, the bureaucracy, which then makes decisions that people don't like and they sue, and that ends up in the court. That's why you have more protests in front of the Supreme Court than across the street at Congress, which is a bizarre dynamic. You'd think that we'd be protesting where we're supposed to fight out our clashes of values or policy views. And then also the federal government has grown. All branches of it have grown, and so swamping traditional state powers and local governments. And so people just there's this centralization in Washington, and so many of these disputes go to the Supreme Court. It's an unfortunate dynamic, and it can only be unwound if we rebalance our powers within Washington, which the Supreme Court has been issuing rulings to strike down the administrative state in many ways, as well as federalism, pushing down decision-making to state and local levels.
And the left doesn't much like that either. But thank you so much, Ilya, for this great conversation. And for more breaking news, exclusive interviews, and conservative views, be sure to check out washingtonexaminer.com.